Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. Charting Toward Intimacy covers mature topics. Listener discretion is advised. We've all been there. You get the look and you're just not really feeling it. Or maybe your husband actually sets up a whole scene for you with candles and music, but you still don't really want to have sex. As nicely as you can, you say no. And then you pray to God, why? Why does he always want sex when I don't? Why can't we want it at the same time? That is exactly the set of questions we're going to be tackling in this week's episode. Welcome to Charting Toward Intimacy, the sex and intimacy podcast for Catholic women. My name is Ellen Holloway, and I am a Catholic speaker and coach who specializes in sex and marital intimacy, and I am on a mission to help you actually enjoy and desire good, holy sex with your spouse. Today, we are talking about initiating, what it is, how to do it, how to accept and decline, and some serious misconceptions that many of us hold about initiating. Okay, so what is initiating? That might sound like a dumb question. Of course, we all know that initiating is when one person asks the other for sex, or maybe you like the word invites the other to have sex with them. But I think this is right here actually where we go astray a little bit when it comes to understanding what initiating actually is. Let me tell you about Anne and Mark. Anne and Mark are newly married. Anne is in many ways pretty much terrified of sex. It was always something she thought of as bad and dirty, and now that they're married, it just feels like she's doing something wrong and not being herself when they try to have sex. It's uncomfortable and it feels gross to Anne. She has pretty much defaulted to no every time that Mark starts showing those signs that he's planning to ask to have sex. Mark loves his new bride. He is also so excited for sex, but it just hasn't been working. He can tell that Anne doesn't really like it, but he has definitely enjoyed the times they've tried and the exploration of each other's bodies. Sex feels like this incredible way that he can share himself with Anne and show her that he loves her. Mark can't wait to have sex again. But he also respects every time that Anne says no. He would never want to hurt his new wife. But when she does say no, he's crushed. Sex is a way that he sees that he can best show his bride how much he loves her. And he's sad to not be able to do so very often. When Mark asks his wife to have sex with him, he's putting himself out there in an extremely vulnerable place. Since Anne continually says no, Mark begins initiating less and less to spare himself the emotional pain of being turned down. Mark is not asking his wife to have sex with him in order to fulfill a sexual urge that he has. He's asking his wife to allow him to give her his love and to love him in return. That is what initiating is. And that is why it is so awkward to do so and why it hurts so much when our spouse says no. Now, this is not me saying that you always have to say yes to sex. Not at all. That's not right either. But it is important that we recognize the vulnerability that is happening when you or your husband initiate sex. Because sex is so much more than a physical urge. Even if the initiating isn't coming from a perfectly chaste place, because it never is, we're fallen. Of course, there is always going to be some level of selfish gratification behind every desire to have sex. Our job as humans, the Christian journey, is to continually work toward things like sex being a gift of self rather than a grasping at pleasure. And this is a lifelong task. But even when initiating isn't coming from a perfectly chaste place, and when the initiating is maybe even more focused on desiring pleasure rather than desiring love, because sex is not just a physical act, there is always going to be that vulnerability present when initiating. Sex is that personal and that holy. It is able to transcend our fallen nature. But let's turn back to initiating. Now that we understand that initiating is basically putting your whole self out there and hoping that your spouse responds in love, let's talk about how we typically initiate and some suggestions on how to initiate moving forward. So, because initiating is so personal, we as humans will often try to hide so we can save face in case there's a no. And humor is one of the most common places that we hide. So that means things like giving kind of that silly look or a butt slap or a, so you wanna with a smirk. Because when we get a no after that, we can always kind of tell ourselves or even say out loud, oh, haha, I was just joking. I don't actually want sex. It's totally fine. But let me make something very clear to you. No one jokes about having sex without actually wanting to have sex. It's just not something humans do. Beyond humor, we can also hide behind subtlety. If we're subtle enough and we get the cue that our spouse doesn't want it, then we can just stop and we've saved ourselves the embarrassment of ever actually asking. Here's the thing with those two tactics. This is what they do to the spouse on the other side. They make them not want to have sex with you. These two styles of initiation are frustrating to say the least. They are unclear and not at all romantic or loving. So, what is my recommendation for initiating? Just do it. If you want to have sex, if you want to show your spouse that you love them through the act of sex, then put yourself out there and trust your spouse. Set the whole scene, light the candles, send a hot text message that is genuine. Slip a note to them during dinner, whisper in their ear, be clear and be loving, and don't hide behind subtlety and humor. Use words or not, but make it clear what you're asking and trust that the answer your spouse gives is one that comes out of love. Now, let's talk about the other side of this, because the person on the receiving end of initiation is in many ways more important than the person who puts themselves out there. No matter what style of initiation that your spouse used to initiate, he or she, but honestly, for the ease of talking, I'm just going to use the example that a husband is initiating. He put himself out there. He basically took his heart out of his chest and is asking if you would like it. Now, you might not want to have sex, but do you want your husband's love? I certainly hope so. And your answer should reflect that, whether you say yes or no to sex. Before we get to how to respond, let's talk about some major misconceptions about this particular situation. Your husband initiates sex and you don't really want it. A lot of times we think for some reason that we should really only say yes to sex if I physically want it in the moment. If that were true, the chances of your physical desire lining up with your husband is crazy low. You're going to rarely have sex. But desire for sex is so much more than just a physical thing. Because sex is more than a physical act. You can desire the unity and closeness that sex brings without being turned on in the slightest. You can desire that deep spiritual connection without even really wanting the pleasure of sex. Now, it can be hard to find that level of desire because our culture doesn't think it actually exists. We see sex as something that you just physically want, and if you don't, then you have low libido and you need to fix that. But that's not true at all. Sure, you might have a lower sex drive for one reason or another, but that doesn't mean you don't ever desire sex. You probably won't ever, or rarely, you'll desire sex from a physical standpoint, but you definitely can desire sex from an emotional and spiritual place. You just need to find that desire. And that might take a lot of work. Prayer, reading good books on theology of the body and sex, listening to this podcast, emotional connection with your spouse through conversation, date nights, etc. I promise that desire is in you. Physical arousal is just one way that God created desire for sex. But we don't have to always rely on physical arousal. And honestly, we shouldn't, because a lot of times relying on physical arousal only turns us toward thinking sex is purely physical, and it can lead us down the path of lust and use. So it's a really good thing to seek out a deeper desire for love and unity that then brings us to sex. Okay, so you've been asked in some way if you want to have sex. The first thing that probably crosses your mind, and it might take just an instant, is the question, am I turned on right now? And if it's a no, your brain probably immediately goes into, okay, how am I going to say no? But instead, I want you to ask yourself, do I want to lovingly connect with my spouse right now? And if the answer is yes, which I hope it is, now your brain can start thinking about how you might like to connect. So if you're not turned on in the slightest, but you're still open to connection, you have a new situation, and you can actually say yes to your spouse's act of vulnerability, even if you ultimately don't have sex. Now, what in the world do I mean here? What I want you to ask yourself is, what am I open to? My spouse has just asked to connect with me. Am I open to connecting through sex? If not, what am I open to? Am I open to dancing in the bedroom? Cuddling, massage, maybe some emotional connection to start and see where the evening leads? A good way to approach this if you're not open to sex, but maybe not completely closed to it, is responding with something like, I'm not sure I'm up for sex tonight, but could we maybe cuddle with our clothes off? Or, hey, I really feel like it's been a while since we've connected emotionally. Could we sit and talk for a little while? Or, why don't we start with a bath together and talk about our day and see where the evening goes? I'm not sure I have the energy for sex tonight, but I do really want to spend time with you. I think you get the idea. You're saying yes to connecting while being honest that you might not want to or be able to have sex. And that's okay. But we should always jump at the opportunity to connect with our spouse. So, offer some ways that you could connect. Let's discuss two more very important topics when it comes to initiation that I hear a lot in one-on-one coaching. The first is initiating in regards to family planning intentions. It is vital that you and your spouse are on the same page about if you're trying to avoid, trying to conceive, open to whatever might happen, or just somewhere along that spectrum. The rub comes when one spouse wants to avoid and the other spouse is anywhere else on the spectrum, and that fertile window comes up. If you are initiating during the fertile window and you know that your spouse wants to try to avoid, that is not fair to them, and it is not fair to yourself either. In most cases, your spouse is going to say no because they want to avoid pregnancy, not because they do not love you or don't want to have sex with you. This is why it is so important to be on the same page, because that situation just causes hurt on all sides. And I really don't want that for your relationship. Now, I'm not talking about the situation where you and your spouse are on the same page of kind of trying to avoid, and you just honestly come to your spouse saying something like, hey, I know it's the fertile window and that we're trying to avoid, but I really would like to have sex with you. Would you be open to using today even though we know it's fertile? That's a different situation. And that sentence right there is exactly how I suggest you handle that kind of a situation. Just be open and honest and communicate what you are thinking and feeling. And of course, be open to connecting in other ways than sex. The other situation I see a lot when it comes to initiation is the situation of a woman being hesitant to initiate because every time she does, her husband thinks that she is already turned on and ready to go and things move too quickly and there isn't adequate foreplay. The key here is communication. Communicate what I shared earlier in this episode about there being different levels of desiring sex beyond physical arousal. And that when you, as the woman in this situation, initiate, you aren't necessarily physically desiring sex at that point, and you still need the normal foreplay that you usually need. This is a conversation to have outside of that particular moment, maybe during a time when sex is off the table, your fertile window if you're trying to avoid, maybe your period if you don't have sex on those days, or sometimes just the night after you have sex. That's often going to be a non-sex day, so that could be a good conversation day as well. So, in conclusion of this episode, it is so important to know that initiating is a lot more than just asking a simple question of, like, do you want hamburgers for dinner? It's pretty much putting your heart in the hands of your spouse and trusting that they will treat it with care. It's important for us to remember that, both on the side of receiving initiations and on the side of being the initiator. When we receive an initiation, we must do so with care and love. Don't ask yourself, am I turned on and ready for sex? Instead, ask yourself, am I open to connect with my spouse? And how would I be open to connecting right now? When you are the initiator, your initiation is going to be treated more seriously and appreciated more if it's real and honest and open and not hidden behind humor or subtlety. Thanks so much for listening. If you are not already following us on Instagram, be sure to check us out at Charting Toward Intimacy. And if you listen to podcasts on a platform that gives you the option to rate or review, we'd love for you to do that because it helps us spread the word about the podcast. If you ever have questions, comments, or episode topic ideas, please reach out to us. We love to hear from you. You can reach out on Instagram or send us an email. Our email is in the show notes. Until next time.